Hi, everybody. This is Rachel from School Psych Podcast. Thank you for joining us tonight. We are excited to have a returning guest, and I hope that you guys caught the previous episode. So that was really exciting and a good one. And so we're really thrilled tonight. We're also coming off of a NASP high. So we were all doing all the things at NASP and taking all the selfies. And it was just a really fun time. I think somebody used the term convention hangover. I think that's what I was feeling afterwards. I was like, I can't do any more school psychology. I can't do any more social media. It's just too much. But it was really fun. And we got to present with Dr. Faustino and Oyen, and they were amazing. And we had just a ball. And I went around taking selfies with everybody. We kind of joked that all these researchers were like Pokemon, and we were going to catch them all and take selfies with them. So we ran around and did that. And we're huge nerds, and just had a lot of like nerdy excitement going on. So it was a fun time. But I'm a school psychologist in the state of Maryland. I'm going to pass it over to my friend Rebecca, who's going to tell you how to participate. Rebecca?
Hi, everybody. I'm Rebecca, and the best way you can participate if you are watching us live is to sign into your YouTube account and comment right alongside the video. We will be watching carefully the live comment feed and sharing your questions and comments with Dr. Canivez. Also, if you are listening later this week or at another time, please continue to comment and share your questions and thoughts using the hashtag #PsychedPodcast. You can comment on Twitter or either of the two Facebook pages, School Psych, Your School Psychologist, or our dedicated page for the podcast, Psyched Podcast, School Psych Podcast. So I will be looking for notifications this evening, but hopefully you are watching us live because you can be a part of this discussion, and we really look forward to having you contribute. And now I will pass it along to Eric.
All right. Hello, everyone. I am Eric, and I am also a school psychologist in the state of Connecticut. And as Rachel mentioned, we are sort of still buzzing from the energy from NASP, and the NASP hangover is kind of a funny analogy, I think. And so like when you have to sort of get over that and nurse that a little bit, you just need a little more school psych to help you through just a little bit. So we're still school psyching it up, as they say, every day. And the energy was contagious. It was fantastic to be around thousands of school psychologists and connect with so many researchers and so many practitioners and administrators in the field as well, trainers, and just talk about the field and learn together, share together, and have fun together as well. So as we have mentioned, we're welcoming back Dr. Gary Canivez, who is kind of a favorite of ours. We first met him in person. The three of us met him in person last year in Atlanta and connected with him really quickly and just thoroughly enjoyed hanging out with him. And I think the first night we chatted with him till the wee hours of the morning, just picking his brain and enjoying stories and just hearing all of the things that he had to say and just making a great connection with him.
Which is why it was especially good. So this NASP, I was able to catch him, but Eric and Rebecca had left already. So I sent them a selfie. I was like, ha ha ha, look who I found. So just side note.
It's so true. Rachel had connected with a few people that Rebecca and I didn't get to see. And so we joked that there was dissension among the ranks with all the people she was able to connect with. But it's all in good fun. And we're so thrilled to reconnect with Dr. Canivez today. So I'm just going to introduce him a little bit with some bio information, and then Dr. Canivez can tell us a lot about ethics, test standards, and test interpretation. Measurement matters. So Dr. Gary Canivez is a professor of psychology at Eastern Illinois University, principally involved in the school psychology training program. He earned his PhD from Southern Illinois University, Carbondale, and was a school psychologist for 8 years in the Phoenix metropolitan area before entering academia. He previously taught grad courses as an adjunct faculty for Arizona State and Northern Arizona universities. Dr. Canivez is a fellow of the American Psychological Association Division 5, Quantitative and Qualitative Methods, and Division 16, School Psychology. Charter Fellow of the Midwestern Psychological Association and a member of the Society for the Study of School Psychology. He is past president of the Arizona Association of School Psychologists and is an associate editor of the Archives of Scientific Psychology. He's a consulting editor for several other journals related to the fields of psychology, school psychology, and assessment. He was an associate editor for psychological assessment from 2011 to 2015 and has served as a grant reviewer for a number of foundations: Israel Science Foundation, Swiss National Science Foundation, Kuwait Foundation for the Advancement of Sciences, and the Research Council for the Sultan of Oman. Recently, he was appointed a senior editor for NASP Journal, School Psychology Review, and is the author of over 100 peer-reviewed research and professional publications and over 200 professional presentations and continuing ed professional development workshops. Dr. Canivez's research interests in applied psychometrics and in evaluating psychometric fitness of psychological and educational tests, including international applications. And he's been selected as a Fulbright specialist for 2019 to 2022 to assist in international projects. And his research has been supported by the National Institute of Health and the National Institute of Mental Health. So this podcast this evening is an abbreviated version of the half-day and full-day workshops of the same title: Ethics, Test Standards, and Test Interpretation, Measurement Matters. And Dr. Canivez, welcome back. We always enjoy talking with you and listening to you and learning from you. So what can you tell us about ethics and standards and measurement?
Eric and Rebecca and Rachel, thanks for having me back again. I must say that I only wish that I had the NASP hangover. On my return, I came back with the NASP flu. So that pretty much wiped me out pretty much most of last week. So I'm sort of fortunate that I was able to get up on my feet and to join you guys for tonight. So thanks for having me back. This is, as was mentioned just a bit ago, this is sort of an abbreviated presentation of a half-day workshop, which is an abbreviation of the full-day workshop that I put together and have taught a number of different times. So this is going to be sort of cliff notes of cliff notes, so to speak. The slides that I'm going to share tonight are sort of the highlights of the workshop that I presented at NASP, and I'm hoping that maybe NASP will have me back next year for the full day session, mostly because I don't get a chance to elaborate on the various psychometric approaches to assessing reliability, validity, and diagnostic utility with a sufficient coverage. So we'll see if there's an appetite for that. The workshop was pretty well attended, but I suspect that was a session that got me exposed to the flu virus. So anyway, let me sort of begin by letting you know that my email address is here on the first slide, as well as my web address for my personal website at the university. And there's a lot of information there that's available. And so if you peruse that and have any questions, you can certainly shoot me an email. I'd be happy to respond. So this workshop, Ethics, Test Standards, and Test Interpretation, Measurement Matters, is a workshop that I've been teaching for quite some time. And it actually was encouraged by Tom Oakland, who was a longtime professor at University of Texas and then at University of Florida. And he himself was quite interested in the interface between ethical standards and practices and principles of tests and what they could and couldn't do, and that we needed to operate within the parameters of what the psychometric fitness of the tests allowed. And so he encouraged me to work on and develop this workshop, and I did. And so I've been presenting it ever since at APA. In fact, this August will be the 10th consecutive year that they're having me teach this full day workshop. And but I've done it for state associations and internationally as well. So I'm getting a trip to International Test Commission because they want me to teach this workshop for them this July. So the idea of ethics, I always sort of start my workshops with a sort of opening remarks that is a long quote from Irving Weiner. And Weiner sort of noted that effective clinicians, A, know what their tests can do, and B, act accordingly. And what he's basically talking about here is that knowing what your tests can do is, in a sense, what psychological functions they describe accurately, what diagnostic conclusions can be inferred from them, and with what degree of certainty. And that implies that there's sort of a probabilistic element to what we do. And then what kinds of behavior can they be expected to predict? And these are wrapped up into this notion about the competence of the psychodiagnostician. And then acting accordingly relates to expressing the opinions that are consonant with the status of the validity data. And doing so is, in a sense, the measure of their ethicality. And I begin with this because it really sort of sets the tone for everything that we do as school psychologists. This happens to function more in the realm of our application of various tests, but we can certainly apply these to all other areas as well. So in terms of covering ethics, most of us are members of the National Association of School Psychologists, which obligates us to behave and function under the ethical principles, which at the present time is the 2010 version. And if we start at the very beginning, there are some ethical standards that have indirect implications for our practice of assessment and testing. And some of them are actually more direct or explicit elements for ethics. And so almost all ethical principles will sort of begin with sort of a general element of beneficence. Our main goal is to help people, help kids. And in order to in a sense, reflect this beneficence, we first and foremost, do no harm. But in order to do this, we have to practice within the boundaries of our competence. We use the scientific knowledge from psychology and education in order to help the clients that we're working with, children, teachers, parents, school systems, and in a sense, our practice in a sense to be competent means that we have to sort of understand what have we been trained to do, what can we do with a degree of sort of supervised experiences. We engage in practices for which we're qualified and competent. Where does that competency come from? It's more than just doing a workshop and then saying, I can go ahead and do this practice now. So there are a lot of features about how you become qualified and how you become competent. A lot of that has to do with background training and theory and practices and supervised experiences of practica and then internship. And even in your first years as a school psychologist, we still have supervision in our first years as a school psychologist. So that's part of it. We're always looking at, well, what is our level of competency, and if there's areas that we're weak, we seek continuing education and supervision to help us improve in that area. As a trainer school psychologist, one of the things that I'm constantly reminded of is that our primary goal is to provide education and training so that we get our students to minimal levels of competency. Not maximal levels of competency, but minimal. And I'm finding that this is, for the past 10 or 15 years, it's becoming more and more impossible to do within just a 2-year training program and a 1-year internship. There's just much too much for students to acquire, to know within a short amount of time. And the profession is going to have to sort of deal with this, which is tough when you're in a circumstance where we have shortages of school psychologists nationwide. So it's kind of hard to say, hey, we need to have another year of training. That's kind of a bitter pill to swallow if we sort of follow that path, but we may very well need to do that. Another ethical principle is the aspect of remaining current in developments and research training and professional practices. And keeping current means that we have to have continuing education. We have to continue to read. We have to look at the journals that service us. And in school psychology, there are many sort of domains or areas that address our needs. And so there's just a lot to have to keep up with. And the field changes and practices need to change with the changing data or evidence that emerges, and that's that's not an easy thing to do. There's sort of limited amount of time. There's only 24 hours in the day. I know for myself that trying to keep up with everything is hard. So it's doubly hard with for school psychologists in practice. Another aspect of professional ethics has to do from NASP point of view is school psychologists monitor their effectiveness of their services and take corrective action or correct ineffective recommendations. And so we've all made recommendations and we follow them up, and this didn't work, so we sort of redouble our efforts and maybe try something new. So we work to correct the ones that are not really working. School psychologists accept responsibility for their practices, decisions, recommendations, and that sort of thing as well. School psychologists, and here we're starting to get at an aspect of the sort of standards, and that is school psychologists maintain the highest standards for responsible professional practices in educational and psychological assessment. And so now we're starting to get more directly into some of the ethical principles in this sort of topical area. School psychologists use assessment techniques and practices that the profession considers to be responsible research-based practice. I might like to replace the research-based with evidence-based or empirically supported. There are a number of practices that people claim to be research-based, and yeah, they might be based on research, but the effects are minuscule and probably as a function that maybe we should either abandon them or at least certainly qualify them. But evidence-based practice is really one of the things that I and a bunch of my colleagues are really sort of moving in the direction of trying to emphasize and to sort of insist on, and that the advances in medicine have, in the last 20 years have primarily been because of following evidence-based practices and using big data or other kinds of sources of data in making better decisions, and which leads to better treatment and better outcomes. School psychologists select assessment instruments and strategies with reliable and valid for the child and the purpose of the assessments. And this one really starts getting into some more detail, and that is instrument use or the strategies in order to determine whether they're reliable and valid for the child means that we have to look at where does that evidence come from? Is there sufficient evidence in technical manuals to inform us on that? And I've written pretty critically on a number of major tests in the Mental Instruments Yearbook, pointing out that there is, in a sense, inadequate information in a number of test technical manuals, such that what's in the technical manual may be insufficient for the examiner to even know whether they should use the test in the first place, especially when we deal with children from a variety of backgrounds, ethnic minorities or language minorities, and cultural minorities, where there's zero information in many technical manuals about the invariance of measurement. And that's really unfortunate because IDEA requires us to engage in practices that are non-discriminatory. Well, if you don't know whether the test is invariant across some of these important variables, then you don't know whether you're going to be acting in a way that is non-discriminatory. And in a sense, it's what we don't know that gets us into trouble. So I would urge a very large amount of caution as we're looking at the use of a number of our tests, basically all our tests. School psychologists choose instruments with up-to-date normative data, and most of the tests we use are tests that have norms to allow us to look at the performance of the individual in regards to the nomothetic, or what does the population have to say? How does this person compare to the population? And that's a very useful kind of comparison, useful element for testing. But it's a double-edged sword, because a new test may come on the market with up-to-date norms, and so we satisfy this requirement. But it might also be that the technical manual is insufficient in giving us information about the adequacy of the measure, the scores, the comparisons, and that sort of thing. And it could be that the research literature doesn't catch up until maybe 2, 3, 4, 5 years later. And if you follow what the test company tells you to do in terms of interpretation, invariably, much of the scores or comparisons that they talk about are inadequate. And we know this from the literature, and we can look at tests like the Woodcock-Johnson 4 or the WISC-5, where the subsequent research that comes out in the peer-reviewed literature shows that the test isn't measuring the dimensions that they claim it to measure with very very much accuracy or function. And then that becomes a problem, because although it has up-to-date norms, a lot of the scores that are provided or the comparisons that they recommend you provide are inadequate in terms of their reliability and validity, which means we're making decisions on kids with scores that are inadequate. And had we have known from the technical manual some of that information was present, we might have made a different judgment about, number one, whether we use the test or not, or number two, which scores we would use, or what comparisons, because we'd have that evidence. So that's something we need to kind of keep in mind as we're looking at tests. Yes, up-to-date norms are great, but as Bojan talked about in 2015, we have to treat a revision of a test as a brand new test, and oftentimes we have to wait till the literature tells us what the test can actually do with sort of independent evaluations. School psychologists conduct valid and fair assessments. Everybody would certainly agree with that. We certainly want to understand children's disabilities, their developmental characteristics, cultural, linguistic, and experiential backgrounds. All of these affect their performance on tests. And that also means that we select and administer and interpret this assessment instruments in light of these characteristics. So this goes back to the comment I made a little bit ago, that we might not have information in the technical manual about how cultural or minority status might affect performance. In fact, that's one of the things that we don't find very much of, if anything, in the technical manuals now, is comparison of how do individuals with different racial or ethnic backgrounds perform relative to each other, or in terms of the measurement and variance. If the test measures differently for different kinds of kids, then we might not be able to make the same kinds of inferences with the scores. And we should not assume that they do unless we have evidence to show that they do. And that's a problem, because that data is available to the publisher, but it does not find itself in terms of presenting information on invariance across some of those important variables in the technical manual. So that's sort of unfortunate, and we probably need to make demands that this is information that must be there for us to make decisions about whether or not we should use the test. And ultimately, it's the individual school psychologist, who's fundamentally responsible for the selection of the test and the use of the test, and maintaining these ethical principles, these ethical standards. If you're an American Psychological Association member, then you're also obligated to the Code of Ethics from APA. And there's a lot of very similar kinds of statements or ethical principles that are nested within APA as well. Providing services, teaching, conducting research based on your education, training, supervised experience, consultation, study, or professional experience. I don't really like the use of the word "or" there, because that pretty much implies that, well, professional experience is apparently maybe all you need. If "or" is a pretty important word in that statement, does that mean that if I just have lots of professional experience that I can call myself competent and provide a service? I would much prefer that to sort of be more like and that professional experience be supervised and that it be training based and so on. So it's we have to pay attention to the word. So maybe in the revision of these ethical standards, maybe we can get that "or" changed to another article. Psychologists work based on the scientific and professional knowledge of the discipline. And in school psychology, we have to pay attention not just to psychological research, but also educational research. And so we probably have a much more difficult row to hoe, as it were, in terms of sort of keeping up with everything. So that's something to also keep in mind. In terms of assessments, APA talks about basing opinions on information and techniques sufficient to substantiate the findings. And so, this is sort of like NASP training standard number 1, right? Data-based decision making, and that we make decisions based upon data. But our decisions are only going to be as good as the quality of the data that we're using. And the old principle of, garbage in, garbage out really does apply. But ultimately, we're the ones that are responsible for whatever we put in a psychological report. That's on us. We're making inferences, or we're suggesting we make inferences about kids, and we have to make sure that the scores and the information that we're basing that on are adequate, are sufficient. Psychologists administer and adapt and score and interpret and use assessment techniques in light of the research on, or the evidence on, the usefulness and proper application of the techniques. This is another sort of element where it takes more than just the technical manual for us to sort of move forward. We have to know, what does the research literature tell us about the various scores and the score comparisons? And it seems like every new version of the test has more and more scores and more comparisons, and not sufficient evidence that they are, in a sense, working the way that they're claimed to work. Psychologists use assessment instruments whose validity and reliability have been established for use with the members of the population tested. And so this gets to a comment I made earlier about individuals from, maybe ethnic minorities or cultural minorities, or maybe across socioeconomic status. These are sort of variables where we sort of need to understand whether our tests work as well across each of these different dimensions. And where there are problems, then we probably need to be much more cautious in their use. The problem is that usually in a normative sample, we have a sizable number of individuals from white or Caucasian background, or Hispanic or Latino, Latina, or African American or Blacks, and there's sufficient sample size to actually do this research. But where we really miss the sample size are individuals from Asian American backgrounds, Native American Indian backgrounds, and there's just a dearth of information available. And because the samples are so small in the standardization sample, although proportionally sampled, you may only have maybe 20 or 30 kids that might be from some of those ethnic backgrounds, and the test companies do not seem to have oversampling in those groups in order to study, or at least if they do, they're not reporting it. So I think we sort of need to sort of look at that. And I know one of my students last year was interested in the WISC-5 and Native American Indian performance, and I sort of tried to get data from around the country, and a number of the contacts that I have, they said, well, we've stopped using the Wechsler scales and we've moved on to like the KBC or other kinds of tests, which didn't help my student any. But we found a school psychologist up in the Northwest Territories of Canada who had a data set of 100 kids from up above the Arctic Circle who they had worked with, and she shared that data with my students to do some research. And it turns out that actually there's some challenges. Now, this was the Canadian WISC-5 with First Nations children up there in the Northwest Territories, but it does indicate that there may be some problems with how adequately a number of dimensions are being measured with that version of the test. So we constantly are looking for information in that regard, so that we understand, what can we say, or what does work well enough with these special populations, and that's sort of important to think about.
And I think that's important too, because if school psychologists aren't thinking about that, and that teachers or parents or nobody else thinks about these things unless we have to be the ones to ask these questions and to do that. Otherwise, it's
Yeah, and especially with the Native American Indian tribes, they're particularly sensitive about the use of tests and measures with their children, and justifiably so. But they're a particularly neglected population, and particularly at risk in society for a number of difficulties and challenges. So we certainly need to do better along those lines as well. The APA ethical standards talk about things like obsolete tests or outdated test results. So we don't base our assessments or intervention decisions on data or test results that are outdated. So maybe the last time the kid was evaluated was maybe 2 years ago, and maybe that data is not sufficient for making decisions today. We may need to update that information. We don't base decisions on or recommendations on tests or measures that are obsolete. So I think I said in the workshop at NASP a week and a half ago, I said, well, anybody out there using the Stanford Binet form LM? If you are, this is many generations way too old. Probably not going to have any reasonable kinds of inferences made from scores from that test. They're just way too outdated. But as I mentioned earlier, even though a test may have brand new norms, that does not necessarily mean that the test in and of itself is going to be satisfactory. And we won't find that out until after we get data from peer-reviewed literature that comes some years later. Psychologists retain responsibility for application and interpretation and the use of assessment instruments, whether or not they score or interpret the test themselves or use automated or other services. And so if you're using a scoring program or if you're using an interpretive program that gives you statements and so on, or things to follow, and they work their way into your report, well, they become yours and your responsibilities, and whatever you can't go back and say, oh, well, that's what the program said. Well, you're apparently saying it too if it makes its way into your report. And so we have to be very cautious about the adequacy of what those comparisons are, the adequacy of the statements that are being made, and do they really apply to this particular kid? We have to kind of think about what the background information is. Do the conclusions and do the results actually fit this particular kid that we're working with? And so I think that's another element where we have to kind of always think about. There used to be a program, I can't remember, it was a report writing program, and I think their motto was just sign it. You put all the information in there and it generates a report, and the implication was all you have to do is just sign it and you're done. Well, chances are there might be some statements in there that may not actually fit for this kid. And so if you just sign it, you might be in some difficulty with that. The International School Psychology Association also has a code of ethics, and I'm not going to sort of go through each one of these, but again, they talk about the same kinds of principles that we've just got done covering with NASP and APA. Although I think that the International School Psychology Association is actually a little more elaborative in some of their areas, all the way down into dealing with rights and dignity and social justice components that work their way into their ethical principles and ethical standards as well. So we'll kind of skip through some of these. They're very similar in sort of background, and those of you who are, if you look at the handouts, you'll be able to sort of see some of these elements that I sort of highlighted from those professional ethics. So the second component, so we recognize that ethics are important and they guide our practices. And we as psychologists and school psychologists, we are individuals who help to maintain these standards for the profession. So if we have individuals, colleagues, or other individuals we could become aware of whose practices we think might be in violation of the ethical standards, then it's our obligation to consult with them and to point out what we think the problems are and try to work it out and get them to change their practice. And if we're not convinced, then we might have to bring up ethical charges or that sort of thing. And so we police ourselves. And the reason we police ourselves is because if we don't do that, then government will step in and take care of it for us. And very rarely do professional associations think it's a good idea for government to step in and try to work within our parameters. So we want to take care of that. So ethics are definitely sort of that sort of foundation that we operate from. But the second part of this aspect of where assessment and testing and so on interfaces has to do with standards. Standards for educational psychological testing. The current version of this is a 2014 publication, and I think that every school psychologist should have a copy of these standards in their professional library and be familiar with what they cover. And what happens with this, and it's a very all-encompassing publication. It deals with everybody from the end user, the psychologists who are using tests, but it also deals with test authors and test publishers and other individuals who come into contact with the development and sale of tests. And so there are a number of features within the standards, some of which are going to have direct implications for school psychology practice. and others it'll be a little more tangential and or covering areas that maybe we don't really deal with as much. But the standards open up in the very first chapter with dealing with validity as the fundamental element for the use of our tests. You know, what kind of inferences can we make about somebody from the scores we get on the measure, regardless of what the measure is. And that's critical. And they give lots of examples of how we might provide or establish validity of our measures. And no one measure is going to, in a sense, be valid for all purposes or all uses. So, you know, we shouldn't expect that a test is going to be able to do, you know, everything. It's not like the Swiss Army knife where yeah, you can do everything with it. It's very specific. There are specific purposes, specific uses, and there are going to be some limitations, and we have to understand what they are. The second chapter deals with reliability and the precision of our measurement and the errors in measurement, and recognizing that all of our measures have error, and we have to account for those, which is why we always interpret our scores using a confidence band. You know, then 95% of the time, the person's true score will fall within a certain range of plus or minus 2 times the standard error of measurement, and so on. And so we want to understand that. And what's interesting is that, you know, validity is talked about first, but it's really founded on sufficient reliability or precision in measurement. So the old adage that you know, if test scores are not reliable, then they can't be valid. If we go to the next step, then if they're not valid, then they can't be diagnostically accurate or diagnostically useful, which is sort of an even higher element for a test. It's fine if it's, you know, it's great. It has to have reliable scores or reliable comparisons, because if we're dealing with, you know, the comparison of 2 scores or comparison of score to the average score, those score differences or score comparisons themselves have to be sufficiently reliable. And if they're not, then any decisions coming from them are going to be in error as well. We might as well, and again, if they operate at chance, then you're just like tossing coins, and we probably don't want to be making decisions on children based on tosses of coins. So that becomes then important too, is that we think about reliability as setting the standard, the base, or the sort of like a base of a pyramid, and then we build on that. We look for validity, and then given sufficient validity, then we want to find out whether or not we can use this test for individual decision making, and that's where the diagnostic accuracy or diagnostic utility comes in. And so that becomes very important to understand as well. And there are more articles starting to be published now in the school psychology literature looking at aspects of diagnostic accuracy or utility, the extent to which we might have you know, risk ratios or database decision making, where we're sort of looking at the odds ratios of individuals, or improving our decision making by adding into our assessment information that is either highly predictive or highly accurate in determining who does or who does not have particular disorders. So we sort of want to think about those things as well. But the standards for educational psychological testing covers a lot of different elements, both from the psychometrics of the test, but also in terms of things like the scores. What are the scores that are provided? Are they normative scores? Are they scores that might be related to you know, diagnosis? So a test doesn't have to have norms to be useful. There are a number of tests that are developed simply based upon items that reflect a particular disorder or condition, and given a certain number of items that achieve a sort of a cut score level, may be sufficient in helping us to identify this person has a high probability of having this condition. Regardless of norms, the symptoms or the characteristics are at a level that are highly predictive or highly accurate in terms of saying this person has this particular condition, whether it's, you know, bipolar disorder or depression or anxiety disorders and so on. So we don't always have to rely on a norm reference test, although most of our tests in school psychology tend to be norm reference, but that isn't necessarily a requirement. It really depends on the purpose. But in terms of using scores, you know, what are the scores that are available? Is there sufficient reliability for them? And then there's also elements of test administration and scoring and reporting and interpretation of the scores, which the standards talk about. And what kinds of evidence do we need to have in order to say there's a high degree of utility to this score, and so I'm going to talk about it. I'm going to interpret it. I'm going to make some inferences about the individual that I'm working with. And if it's not sufficient, then we probably ought not say very much, if anything. Or maybe we don't use that particular measure because it may be not sufficient for the purpose that I want to use it. And we have to sort of understand that. Certainly areas of workplace testing and credentialing, individual school psychologists are probably not going to be involved with that element. But certainly in educational testing and assessment, we are. And so there are a number of chapters that have more direct applications for school psychology practice. So one of the things that I always kind of cycle back to is you have ethics and you have a number of test standards that say our tests need to have these characteristics, these fundamental psychometric properties for the variety of scores or comparisons that are provided. So we then say that these are the kinds of the psychometric fitness of our tests, measures, comparisons, and that sort of thing. So we sort of put these two things together, and it brings us right back to Irv Weiner's admonition. That is, effective clinicians know what their tests can do and act accordingly. And so this becomes then, how do you know that your test can do what it claims to do? And if we look at the claims that are made, within test manuals, or advertisements or clinical guidebooks that many of us have on our bookshelves, or we were even taught from, well, that becomes then an issue of the principles of measurement and statistics. And so if we're going to follow Weiner's advice, then psychologists have to have fundamental competencies in measurement. That means we have to understand the principles of how we assess and what are the standards for satisfactory test score reliability and validity and utility and norms. And these become fundamental competencies that professional psychologists and school psychologists need to have. And if you don't have them, then it becomes very difficult, if not impossible, to make a judgment about whether a test has satisfactory reliability and validity and diagnostic accuracy. But in a sense, professional ethics dictate that is our responsibility to know. So one of the things that happened a number of years ago was there was a survey that was done in 1990. Leona Aiken and others at Arizona State University did a survey of doctoral training programs in terms of what did they do in terms of training doctoral level psychologists in terms of measurement. And then in 2008, Aiken, Weston, Millsap basically replicated that survey. They wanted to see what changed since their first survey. And it turned out not very much. Very little had changed in the doctoral training programs in terms of measurement. So then they quoted, "We find it deplorable that a dozen years later, the measurement curriculum in psychology, it basically occupies a median of 4.5 weeks. In 4.5 weeks, you are unable to make a dent in what is required to be known in terms of advanced measurement principles and statistics that directly apply to the various scores and comparisons within a test to make a judgment about sufficient reliability and validity and diagnostic utility." And they concluded that most graduates lacked fundamental competency in measurement. Now, if you think about that, if you're not competent, then you are incompetent. If you're incompetent, then that's unethical, necessarily unethical, which leads to a really huge problem, because how many of us actually received satisfactory training in measurement and statistics to be able to open a technical manual and understand what's there that's supportive, what's not there that should be there, and what's there that actually is factually incorrect or not satisfactory support, but passed off as satisfactory support? And when I ask this question in my workshops, whether it's at APA or at NASP or in state associations, I get a few hands that get it raised, but they're usually university trainers who have some psychometric background. But the vast majority, almost all of the practitioners, they don't raise their hand. And that really spells out one of the major problems from my perspective of the entire profession, and that is measurement is, in a sense, minimized. by not being demanded in terms of a course to actually teach advanced measurement. So at the end of this survey, they said, well, the solution to this problem is, coursework. That when you're in a graduate program, and I would not distinguish between specialist level training in school psychology from doctoral level training with regard to this criterion, and that is everybody needs to have satisfactory training in this so that we can be competent in understanding what works, what doesn't, so that we can, in a sense, ethically use the tests that we're being asked to use. And if we're not, and this is one of the problems, is that there doesn't seem to be a demand from the accrediting bodies to say you will have an advanced measurement course that covers topics of reliability, validity, diagnostic utility, foundations of or philosophy of science, and where's how do we judge the qualities of this background. And if we don't have coursework in it, then we're just simply telling people, yeah, this stuff doesn't really apparently matter very much. But I would argue that it matters a great deal. And in fact, one of the things that that we're finding out is that in the latest surveys, John Kranzler and others just published a study recently in Contemporary School Psychology where they looked at the assessment practices for identifying specific learning disability. And it sort of was a shoot off of another larger survey in terms of professional practices. But it is telling that a lot of the practices that are being used on a regular basis, according to those who completed the survey, are practices that have been shown not just that we don't know that there's adequate reliability, but we know that they're inadequate in terms of reliability. Things like the processing strengths and weaknesses approaches. Most of those methods have the fundamental scores that are going into them are inadequate. And their comparisons or the different scores or so on are in a sense even worse. So that basically means that many professionals are using practices that have been shown repeatedly in literature not to work, and yet they're still being used. And I suspect part of the reason they're still being used is that there's some intuitive value to them. That's one thing. But then the other part is that they've been taught to use these things by people who may not understand some of these weaknesses and the psychometrics themselves. So it's a much bigger problem, I think, than maybe most are willing to admit. And so part of it's a training issue. And I tell people in the workshop, I say, look, I don't blame you. If your training program didn't have a course in this, then why should I expect that you would know about this? And I applaud you for coming to a workshop that is dealing with these difficult topics. Because when they look at the research literature that is, in a sense, not consistent with what's being presented in the technical manuals, they are quite unhappy and ask me, why isn't this information in the technical manual? Why isn't this? And I have to say, well, it's not that it wasn't available. The choices were made in terms of what went in the technical manual. I don't know why they made the decision about leaving some information out, but I point out what is missing that needs to be there, and I've done it in a number of publications, either through the Mental Measurements Yearbook or journal articles that point out, what these shortcomings might be. And so, that becomes then an issue for us to sort of consider as well. So measurement and statistics are important. Number one, because we have to choose tests. Which tests are we going to use? We have to choose what test, with whom are we going to use the test? Under what conditions? Are there some conditions where a certain test would be okay, but maybe not in another condition? How do you know? How do you know which test or which scores you might interpret? And in a sense, this really is a fundamental question that pretty much the psychometric fitness of the test, whether it's the norms, the reliability, the validity, and diagnostic utility, how are you going to use the test? What is the purpose for your assessment? We have to have these answers to satisfactorily use the tests that are available. We can get information from test manuals, but again, as I mentioned, there are a number of shortcomings, manuals that are incomplete or inadequate. in terms of their presentation. We can get information from the professional literature. Some journals, like the Journal of Psychoeducational Assessment, will at times have more elaborate test reviews than the Mental Measurements Yearbook is able to provide. We might find that there are professional newsletters that sometimes will have a test review in it. So there are a number of sources of information, but we sort of have to look for it. And we'll also see information in the professional literature in terms of specific journal articles that deal with particular tests or particular scores from tests in terms of evaluation of their psychometric fitness. But ultimately, regardless of the source of information, we have to, in a sense, evaluate the information that's presented to us. How do you judge the accuracy or the viability of the statements that are being made, whether it's test authors or publishers, whoever is responsible for placing that information? How do we judge the adequacy? If we don't have the competencies in psychometrics or those measurement principles, we are unable to make those judgments. We just don't know, and that's a huge problem. And to a large extent, if we don't know what we don't know, then we're really in big trouble, and we fall prey to claims or recommendations coming from people who are authority figures. And you never, in a sense, want to sort of just simply believe in something simply because an authority figure told you what truth was, especially if there's a financial conflict of interest. We are particularly susceptible under those kinds of conditions to, in a sense, falling prey or making bad decisions about test use under those conditions. So we have to understand that. So basically, measurement and statistics and ethics and science all sort of are wrapped up together. The major emphasis is always ethics and test standards that are really the guiding principles. What's interesting is that as far back as 1938, in the very first issue or the edition of the Mental Measurements Yearbook, Oscar Burroughs wrote in the preface, "Test users have every right to demand that test authors and publishers present full particulars concerning the methods used in constructing and validating the tests which they place on the market." 1938, and we're still not there. We still do not have the full particulars being presented. And when we look at the research literature and in the peer-reviewed literature in subsequent years, we find that the tests fall way short of what the claims are. So if you're using the practices of interpretation that come from the manual, there's almost entirely 100% chance you're probably going to be making interpretive statements or inferences about kids. They're probably not supported by the empirical evidence. And that's probably not a really good way to operate if you're counting yourself as a science. Science requires that we have replicated research that supports the practice. And what we're finding is that a lot of folks are simply using intuitive approaches. They make sense and they're well-intentioned, but they may very well be wrong. And that means we make bad decisions. So I like the Royal Society's motto. So the Royal Society in the UK is it's like our Academy of Sciences. But back in the 1500s, when this was established, they had a motto: nullius in verba. Basically, take nobody's word for it. You have to reason for yourself. You look at the evidence, you come up with your own conclusions. Don't take something because an authority figure, even me, don't believe it just because I said it on this podcast or in a workshop. In God we trust, all others must bring data. I'm absolutely sure of the second principle there. Everybody has to have evidence and data. And where it doesn't exist, then we have to, in a sense, be especially cautious and especially understanding whether or not there's a financial conflict of interest on the part of the person who's making the recommendation. If they're making the recommendation but they have something to sell, and in a sense your decision making is based upon your having that thing that they're selling, then that can be a problem. So finally, I just wanted to sort of, I gave a list of publications here and areas that the audience might be interested in looking at. And so the references are here to look up. And one of the, certainly one of the more important ones is Richard McFall's Manifesto for a Science of Clinical Psychology. And although he wrote it for clinical psychology, I think it definitely applies to school psychology practice too. Just substitute the word school psychology for clinical psychology. I think we'd be in a much better position. But the other thing that we want to be aware of is the Turner, Demers, and Fox and Reed article from 2001, which is APA's guidelines for test user qualifications. And this is a sort of a publication that I have on the slides. It's sort of summarized some of the different tables. It's what we sort of need to know. We need to know things like the sources of variability and measurement error in our tests. Where does it come from? Where does error come from in our tests? And it comes from all kinds of places, including us not administering the test properly. And this happens. We drift away from the standardized procedures over time. Surgeons have to go back and get requalified for practices, I believe. And do we ever have to go back and recheck to make sure we're administering the WISC-5 or the WISC-4, according to the standardized guidelines? We sort of assume that people are doing that, but maybe we ought not make that assumption too wisely. All the different knowledge needed in terms of selecting the various tests. And so these are all psychometric principles that we need to be aware of. And if you look through this list and you see terms and you sort of know of them, but you really are not very sure about, how you assess for them, then in a sense, that's an area that is, sorely in need of improvement, because these are critical elements in judging what the test can and can't do. Aspects about additional knowledge necessary, things like legal rights and procedures, standardized procedures, and that sort of thing. Factors in dealing with test use with diverse groups is another area that they talk about, including things like test bias. It turns out that actually a lot of our tests in school psychology practice, intelligence tests, and so on, there's a lot of evidence to show that a lot of our tests are not biased. Fairness is an entirely different matter. But does the test work the same way? And for some of them, the scores may work pretty similar. But in a sense, each test and score is specific, and so some scores might be satisfactory, others might not be, and so we have to sort of apply these things to the test and all its variety of scores. And the more scores and the more comparisons, in a sense, the more questioning we need to be in terms of whether or not we're adequate in these areas. And then there's parameters that are also specified in terms of dealing with testing disabled individuals, which certainly we work with as school psychologists. So I'm going to kind of end here with sort of the slide that deals with what are the foundations of measurement. And I've mentioned them a number of times: reliability, validity, utility, or the individual applications, and norms. And then there's a bunch of slides that sort of follow after this, but we certainly don't have time in 1 hour to kind of go through everything. But people can sort of look at the slides and the handout and think about these different facets. And I'd sort of like to be able to answer questions that people might have posted or so on, to answer questions that some might have.
We've had a lot of good comments, I think, and I want to use my fancy ability to put the comments up on the screen here, but I'm trying to scroll back because there's so much talk going on. But I like this one. I'm becoming increasingly aware that there is a disturbing lack of research base for many practices that are pervasive in the profession. And that was followed up with this one here. Yikes, if our assessment tools aren't measuring what they're supposed to be measuring, then why are we using them? And I think that what speaks to me is, I think that when I was a new school psychologist, you pick up the manual, you pick up the test, like this is the test that everybody else uses, and you go and you use it, and you don't, and the manual says it's awesome because, it's the manual and they're selling, it's a product, but we have to remember it's a product. And so just because they say that it measures what it measures, they say that it's appropriate for this population or that population, again, they're selling something to you. And that's, I think, pretty obvious too. When you go to a NASP convention, you see all the fancy booths and they're passing out all the pens and all the cool stuff and the raffles, and, it's a product. So it's good to keep in mind.
Yeah, and I think one of the things that, and I sort of usually open up my workshops with a sort of a little bit of a narrative. When I got my school psychology degree, got my PhD, and then I went out to Arizona, I was taught to interpret intelligence tests pretty much like the way most other people have done over the years, and still in many places how it's done today. And it's, interpreting the full scale, and then it's interpreting the, at the time, IQ scores, and then it was the factor scores, and then it was the subtest, and then it was the subtest comparisons, and then it was pairwise comparisons. I mean, literally, it was every bloody comparison under the sun, because that's just what, in a sense, was talked about. And in my very first year as a school psychologist, I started reading articles that were being published in Psychological Assessment and School Psychology Review, and so on, that was pointing out that, hey, most of these scores, the reliability are so inadequate that they're operating at chance. And if that was the case, I'm writing this 2.5-page long report of the cognitive portion of the report. And probably outside of the full scale score, nothing else really had satisfactory reliability. Why was I writing 2.5 pages on scores that were not sufficient in terms of reliability? So I really had this sort of professional existential crisis in front of me. And there was a slide that Ryan McGill put in our documented session at NASP, and it was one of the last slides, and it was basically Morpheus holding out his hand. There's a red pill in one hand and a blue pill in the other. And I said, and that's kind of how I felt. And this is actually before the Matrix actually came out. And it's like, okay, I took the red pill because I really wanted to, in a sense, act in a way that was consonant with the validity evidence. And not because my professors taught me what to do, but rather what does the evidence allow for me to do as an ethical psychologist. And so by doing that, my reports became much shorter, and I was making less inferences about kids that were most likely not true. And that brings us to the other question in terms of, well, would I give a test that requires me to give 7 or 10 subtests, or will a test that has 4 subtests that I can maybe get it done in 20 or 30 minutes? If that's satisfactory for estimating the overall global score, maybe I just simply use that test and move on and go do something else with my hour or more saved time in the assessment practice. So I think we need to be more efficient. And that's one of the ways that we can address the shortage of school psychologists. If we're not running around giving WJs and whisks to everybody under the sun with the illusion that these patterns and profiles and so on are going to give me some real useful meaning, maybe I just simply estimate G really well with a more brief measure, WASI or RIAS or other kind of measure, and be more efficient with my time and less inferences that are more high stakes inferences with scores that are insufficient.
I'm seeing also, I'm going to put this comment up here. I want to know your thoughts here. What this presentation does, and it's the second time I've heard him speak, is make me appreciate Iowa's special education model more and more. So they're not categorical. So
it's probably a reasonable thing given the fact that we really don't have rule in or positive predictive power methods for identifying kids with, let's say, specific learning disabilities. There just are no adequate measures to actually rule kids in. We have good ways to rule kids out, but the thing is, we're not actually doing evaluations to rule out LD. We're looking for ways to rule them in. And to be honest, if we're dealing with a kid with learning problems or their achievement is not adequate, well, we kind of know the technology about how do you teach kids to read. We're getting better at how do you teach kids to do math. So maybe we just sort of look at what the kid's skill level is and, in a sense, work on having them develop mastery and move on from there. Because the psychometric phrenology that we seem to be engaging in isn't really doing the job.
That's a good point. And I think just based on everything you said, the likelihood of our false positives are extremely high, given what we're looking at. There were a lot of really good comments, as Rachel mentioned. Dr. McGill chimed in as well. So shout out to Dr. McGill, who's been a guest here as well.
Who we could not track down at NASP. Just going to throw that out there.
He was the other unicorn. But some good thoughts about non-categorical and really just giving kids what they need rather than going through this taxonomy of disabilities that we may or may not be able to accurately measure and quantify. But then, when we think about all that, what does the kid really need? The bottom line is, effective instruction in XYZ. Right. We don't need all this other stuff to wade through that.
Yeah, I'd be curious to know what proportion of kids who have difficulty in, let's say, reading, what proportion of those kids are actually being taught with methods that are not consistent with the National Reading Panel. Mm-hmm. Therein lies the problem for many kids. And it doesn't take, cognitive tests or other kinds of diagnostic tests to figure out what the problem is there. It's a tier 1 instructional delivery problem.
Yes.
Unfortunately, we don't ever blame the curriculum. We almost always blame the kid.
Right.
That is so true. And so, that reading is one of the things that I'm like most fired up about right now. And I see these great movements to change some of that. And I see dyslexia movements, and I see, people advocating for better, screening of dyslexia and better interventions like tier 2 and tier 3. And I think that that's all awesome. We need to advocate for things like that. But then I look back to tier 1, and we can test these kids all day long, and we can compare our scores all day long, and it just kind of muddies the water a little bit if tier 1 is not doing what it's supposed to be doing. How can you even go?
Right.
I don't know.
Well, and it also brings out the other part, and if we're thinking about, let's say, cognitive tests in terms of informing, number one, they don't seem to give us useful information in terms of correctly identifying kids who might have LD. But the more problematic element is that there have not been found many interventions that come out of that actually differentially work with kids. So, Matt Burns published a study, a meta-analysis, sort of looking at those kinds of things. So if what we're doing to a great extent takes a lot of time with expensive tests, and our professional time is very expensive, that's a waste of resources when it's not actually leading to actually better interventions, actually direct effects on the actual teaching and skill development of the kids. And so in a shortage of school psychologists, maybe we just spend our time differently, more wisely, more efficiently. And I think if we do that, we'd probably serve kids even better, even with shortages.
Yeah. That's a hopeful note. I like that. I also want to say the comments next to the YouTube video have been such a great conversation that I encourage anyone who is listening to the recorded broadcast to log into YouTube and watch the video so that you can join the conversation, because as you're watching, you can also contribute, and it links up to the same time where others were commenting tonight. So I hope that we can continue the discussion over time. There's so many great ideas here, and just good thoughts. The most sad faces emoji that we've probably had in a while, but when we know better, we can do better. So I think that's hopeful.
Absolutely.
Okay. Awesome. Thank you so much for coming. And I know that was really tough to cram in, it was a full-day workshop and just kind of hitting the highlights. So, yeah. And I think that, so your half-day presentation on NASP though, that should be up, right, for members who want to pay for that presentation. Was it recorded or no?
I signed the paperwork for it to be recorded. I used the microphone in the room. I do not know if it actually was recorded or not. I have no idea. So maybe they were doing it behind the scenes, and it's so great.
Yes, it definitely was recorded. The post-test questions still have to be created. So for people who want to earn the credits, but it will be up on NASP's website soon, and we highly recommend it.
Okay, awesome.
Very good.
All right, and our next podcast, just looking ahead, is going to be with Dr. Mackey, who's going to talk about LD, and I think that'll be a good one as well. 3:15, it looks like, is what I'm seeing. So that'll be good. And we caught her, Eric and I both caught her. I think Rebecca had already left by the time, but we caught a good presentation by her. So that'll be a fun one. And looking for last minute comments.
And
it looks like Dr. McGill is chiming in. I'm going to use my powers and put him up there. The documented session, so that you guys both did from NASP, was recorded as well, so people can look for that.
That's
I
good.
do want to make a quick note that the documented session was basically an invited presentation that was based on the article of the year from the Journal of School Psychology in 2018. And Elsevier, who is the publisher for the journal, is making that article available as a free download from the journal for an additional 6 months. So anybody who's interested in that particular article, you can download it for free, and you might want to share that with legislators at the state level or the federal level, because there's a lot of gold in there in terms of helping to make better decisions about law and practices in education and school psychology practice.
That's
awesome. That just triggered. I've got one last quick question. Because you mentioned law. Do you think that? So obviously we aren't, as school psychologists, being challenged when we use a measure that's not appropriate, because nobody else knows this stuff, and most school psychologists don't know this stuff. Do you think that things would change if there were lawsuits brought, like if there was a savvy lawyer that like picked it apart and really actually knew some stats?
Yes, I think that would it's sort of something that is likely to happen at some point. When I do not know, but certainly, answering the question: are the scores that you're using for your diagnostic decision making, are the comparisons that you're using, are they based upon evidence in the peer-reviewed literature that are supportive? And if the answer is no, you probably ought not be using them. Or if you do, you should actually be presenting it like an experiment and saying, we don't know whether this works or not, so we're getting informed consent for you to act on this in a particular way. And then that also requires us to dictate what the positive and possible negative outcomes might be if we were to go down that road. Then the parent can make an informed decision about this rather than just simply following our guidance and our best intentions, but maybe not evidence-based.
Mm-hmm. Awesome.
Makes sense. I wanted to add, I think we have Stefan Dabrowski also coming on in April. So
Nice.
all three of you guys will have made the podcast. So, and I'm really glad that the article will be available and the session, because I think we had a committee team meeting during the session, so we weren't able to attend that Wednesday of NASP. So looking forward to seeing the video or the
And we can
Very
post
good.
that article too. We'll put that up on the YouTube link or on the YouTube description. All right.
Awesome.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you,
Thanks,
everyone.
guys.
Thank you, Dr. Canivez.